Hello. I'd just like to introduce our next moderator, Martine Lubrink. And Martine really took on the responsibility of this panel and has done a really phenomenal job of bringing together some global experts on economy-wide risk. So with that, I'll turn it over to Martine.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I want to thank Peter and Atif and Ryan and Lindsay for inviting me and allowing to assemble this panel. It's been a joy. My name is Martine Lubrink. I'm at Victoria University in Wellington. Before, and some people in the audience may know me, I was associated with Lancaster University. However, the last year that I was employed at Lancaster University, I spent in North Carolina. And you may, of course, at the moment that you think about going back to the UK, you think twice and maybe a third time and a fourth time before going back to the UK. The coffee is less, the weather is not so great. So I applied for a job at the central bank about exactly 10 years ago, the Central Bank of Holland, because they needed an accounting expert with some knowledge about the accounting standard setting from an academic point of view. And I remember the interview with the guys that hired me, the manager, and I asked them about things going on in the US economy and the UK economy. Northern Rock had collapsed, Bern Stearman had just taken over, there were foreclosures, and I asked my future managers, what's going on here? Is there anything that you should worry about in Holland? No, they said, this is really only an American problem. And so I thought, the UK has become unsafe, US is becoming unsafe, and Holland is this island of tranquility. What could potentially go wrong? Probably nothing. So then I joined, I think, mid-July, and then people were still bliss. And it was all about, I think, the introduction of IFRS that kept us busy until 6 weeks after I entered my job, and then it was September 2008. So then everything started spreading like wildfire. And the fire only started ending, I think, in April or March 2009. So it took a long time before everything became calm again. So this is about contagion. The session today is about contagion. Next to me, I have a couple of speakers that will discuss the topic of contagion and interconnectedness. So next to me, sitting, for some reason, he's not at Norwegian Central Bank or the Norwegian Financial Authority, but he's at the Peterson Institute, and he's co-founder of Bruegel. It's Nicholas Veron. Next to Nicholas is sitting Chaya Brandler-Horst. She was a colleague of mine at the central bank, but now works together with Roger O'Donnell at KPMG, and they have these dynamic risk assessment models that are kind of nifty in finding out or discovering risks that haven't been uncovered yet. And then at the far end, sitting Dan Davies, who I learned to know from Twitter, basically, together with Nicholas. I'm not sure. Dan has 12,000 followers. I have 1,200 followers. I'm not sure how many you have.
In the middle.
In the middle, okay. Fair enough. So that is the podium for us to discuss, because regulatory developments in banking go very quickly on the day. There's something new happening in Europe, the US, et cetera, et cetera. So Twitter is the best medium to get up to speed with that knowledge. So I'll leave it over to the panel to discuss. As you may have noticed, we sit down. Why is that? Because that's how regulators work. They do their discussions sitting down. I've been used to that. It gives a little bit more opportunities to discuss and to interact. I'm here between you. You have questions. They have the knowledge. There's 75 minutes, and I encourage you, with permission of these speakers, to interact as much as possible so that you can have your answers questions. So the floor is now for Nicholas, who will discuss what has been achieved over the last 10 years.
Thanks, Martin, and especially thanks for the last point you made. My two main employers, Bruegel and the Peterson Institute, are think tanks. They are policy research organizations, if you will. So that's research, but not academic research, with the aim to have an impact on policies. And we have a very strong internal culture in both organizations of interrupting each other all the time, disagreeing with colleagues and the like. So I encourage you to do that for me as well. For the sake of disclosures, because I will talk about derivatives trade reporting, I should also mention that I'm an independent board member at the Trade Repository Operation of DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. So Martin asked me to talk about what has happened in the world over the last 10 plus years in terms of thinking about contagion and systemic risk from the standpoint of policies and market development. And that's a pretty broad scope for a less than 10 minutes presentation. So I'm not going to answer the brief he gave me. I'm going to say a few things about policies, market developments, and what I see as the big challenges, but that will inevitably be very selective and very, very high level. So I'm not entering into any details, but I hope that thanks to your interruptions, the discussion we'll have on the panel and the Q&A will go more into the weeds. If I take a very high-level view of what's been happening from a policy perspective on these issues of contagion and interconnectedness, I would say, well, first, obviously, if you listen to what policymakers say, central bankers, financial stability officials, etc., there is much more of a discourse of, macroprudential policy, financial stability, not just basically thinking about the macroeconomic models as having something to do with the financial system and not ignoring the financial system. So in conceptual terms, that's progress, and people do a lot of network analysis and things like that. Whereas they haven't got, of course, is having a model of the entire economy, a structured macro model, whether DSGE or any kind of that macro modeling, that would actually have the financial system in it, because that's a bigger challenge than has been met so far. But the discourse is more accommodative of this idea that financial stability is something that macroeconomists should have in mind. So that's progress. I think there has been some progress, but I'll come back to the limitations of this in terms of information in the hands of policymakers. So the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements have this project of data gaps. So they have tried to nudge the statistical institutions of individual countries and jurisdictions towards giving more and better harmonized information about financial sectors, financial systems, and the associated risks. There's been this mandate to report derivatives trade to trade repositories. I mentioned my own affiliation in there. So this idea that policymakers at the global level should be able to aggregate exposures in the derivatives markets to have a view as much as possible in real time of risk concentrations and how they evolve. There has even been, and this is very few people have paid attention, but I think it's actually significant, an attempt to have bank-level exposure, individual exposures data aggregated for the 30 or so most systemically important banks in the global system, so the global systemically important banks in the Basel jargon, to have that data aggregated in a single data hub. So there is a secret team well, not secret, but very discreet team in Basel that tries to aggregate this bank-level information from individual supervisors, and as you can imagine, it's not an easy job. But they're making progress. So there have been a lot of pioneering efforts to get this kind of relevant, maybe even significant information at the global level. There's been obviously a lot of effort on addressing the too big to fail challenge and making individual financial institutions resolvable. So that individual institutions could be made to fail in a crisis, by which policymakers means that creditors will take losses. The US has extended its existing framework of resolvability for deposit-taking banks to systemically important non-banks, like in the crisis we had with AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, most of the most problematic institutions in the crisis have been these systemically important non-banks, because the US already had a functioning system for resolving banks. For example, Washington Mutual was resolved with losses to creditors, and I would argue the system worked in that case. $300 billion balance sheet, it was not small. So the US has extended this to systemically important non-banks. In the case of the EU, of course, they had no resolution framework whatsoever, and the doctrine or the stance was bailout for everybody. They're moving towards bail-in, and they have introduced this Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive, which is basically emulating the US model. The rest of the world, it's more nuanced. The Financial Stability Board is trying to push that model elsewhere. It exists arguably in Switzerland. In other jurisdictions, it's more problematic. In terms of the too big to fail, again, there have been attempts to create disincentive for banks or financial institutions being too large. The most significant one is a surcharge for globally systemically important banks, for which there is now a framework and a list, which I mentioned, from the Financial Stability Board. And there have been some attempts at putting some limits on the complexity of banking structures, living wills, the Volcker rule. Banking union can be viewed in that, through that lens as well. And of course, evolving market structures anyway. Banking union is a driver of evolving bank market structures in Europe. Brexit, if it happens, if the UK leaves the single market, will also drive a lot of changes in financial system structures in Europe and globally. Now, if I look at market developments, I think from a global perspective, relatively little of this has been driven by policy so far. So if I take a step back, the last decade, what have been the most significant market developments in terms of the shape of the global financial system, I'd say the biggest is the expansion of the financial system in China. There has been this huge credit expansion in China. The Chinese banking system is now the largest in the world, measured by size of assets at, of course, exchange rate, market exchange rate parity. So Chinese banking system now has significantly bigger assets than the Eurozone banking system, which itself is twice the size of the US banking system, to give an order of magnitude. Because as you know, the US banks tend to be asset light. Financial integration has progressed if you take out the European Union. So there has been some financial fragmentation in the European Union, but that's a Eurozone-specific issue predominantly. And if you take that out, financial integration has progressed, not regressed in the last decade. Some people say, we have had financial deglobalization. That's not true. That's true in Europe, but not from a global perspective. I think actually the point on Europe is temporary, and I expect a lot of cross-border M&A in Eurozone banking, in particular in the next 3 to 5 years. So I think we haven't had a reversal of financial globalization, and I don't expect it to happen, at least in a baseline scenario. And in the meantime, there has been a lot of financial development and deepening. I mentioned China. China now has a much more diverse financial system than 10 years ago. So it's not just the banks. You have these very innovative financial firms like Alipay and WeChat Finance, part of Tencent. Alipay is a financial arm of Alibaba. But if you look at Europe as well, we may discuss the policy of capital markets union. Probably the jargon of this is familiar to some of you. It hasn't gone very far at this point in terms of policymaking, but actually the European financial system, even in the Eurozone, has diversified away from its dominant reliance on bank finance in the last 10 years, even so it's a slow movement. So lots of basically a direction of travel towards financial integration and development at the global level. Now, if I think of the challenges, it will echo what I said at the beginning about the policies. I think all this is very unfinished business. So there is no new paradigm compared with the pre-crisis era. Macroprudential policy is something that policymakers talk a lot about. They have created, new committees and bodies and lots of turf wars, but it's still not clear what macroprudential policy means in terms of actual policy instruments and impact. So it remains to be seen whether this is a thing or not. In terms of the data, the vision of a global risk map and real-time information about derivatives trade and exposures, I think, is very compelling, and there is no technological problems. The technology is there. You don't need a blockchain or anything fancy. But the governance is dysfunctional. And at this point, the promise of derivatives trade reporting, which is that policymakers could aggregate exposures and see the big picture, has not been delivered upon and will not be delivered upon anytime soon. The resolution model, only time will tell. I think at this point there is scope for hope that Europe, for example, will get to the point where the US has been, i.e. being able to resolve small and medium-sized banks with losses to creditors, but the too big to fail challenge remains very much something that will only be tested in the next crisis. So limitation on size, I think there is scope for enormous skepticism. Despite the the systemically important bank surcharge, I think banks will continue to grow in charge and we'll see increasingly significant banks, certainly in the Eurozone. The ECB actually will encourage cross-border M&A, including among large banks, and I think the right answer is to push integration, but that means more larger institutions. So I think there is a lot of scope for skepticism about the ability of authorities to limit size. So that's my conclusion. I think we're seeing this trend. I think there has been a lot of policy innovation in the last decade or so, but the institutional response to what challenges have been identified in the crisis are still behind the curve compared with the ongoing pace of financial deepening, financial development and innovation, and cross-border financial integration without the corresponding institutions at the global level. And I'll stop with there.
Thank you very much. So this time is different. If I listen to Nicholas, maybe Gaia can explain why this time may not be that different.
I don't think that's what he said at all. I was so glad to hear him mention talk already about the next crisis, because that's obviously and that obviously comes from Carmen Reinhardt's book, This Time is Different, where we always say, well, this time it's different because we've learned from our mistakes and we have better institutions now and we have new regulations, and of course we do. But it's a bit, crises are a bit like the flu. We've already experienced it, but we're going to experience it again, because the next time it's going to be different enough for us to not recognize it. So I took this from her book because I think it's very interesting. And you've been staring at it for a while now, so I'm sure you know. The solid line are the crises. So we know that. And I think what's interesting about that is really this period. And if you look at it in the bigger perspective, that was an unusually stable period. And that's exactly why we were so surprised by the crisis, because financial crises are actually quite common. But the period after Second World War, Bretton Woods, that was an unusually stable period. But I would argue that's not the world we live in anymore. And we're still using the tools that we developed during this period. And I think another interesting thing from this chart, at least as interesting, is the dotted line, which is a proxy for our financial interconnectedness. And also they are very low, limited capital flows. Also not the world we live in today. In fact, today we live in the age of interconnectivity. As a growing number of scientists say, including, for example, Anne-Marie Slaughter, former Princeton dean. And I think that's very interesting because it changes how things work. Just like if we have more mass, things that are possible change. And when we live in an interconnected world, things change. So that's why we started to look into systems thinking. So one of the things, and this is related to network analysis, which of course regulators have adopted since. We used to look at risk in isolation. So we look at this, or we look at credit, we look at liquidity and market. And we had all these different frameworks. And then we saw actually these risks tend to occur in a cluster. So what that means is once one risk has materialized, all of a sudden these other risks are becoming more probable as well, which means there's no constancy. You cannot assume that something is constant. So if you look, and for that, to really grasp that, you need to look deeper into the system. So you go beyond the event of a crisis, you go to the pattern, which of course regulators already do, and all the academics here as well. That's where econometrics resides, which is where I started out in my career as well. But then at one point, I noticed that everything in the end is driven by human behavior. And human behavior is very much shaped by the structures that we have underlying that. So I took this quote from the World Economic Forum because I think it's very interesting. I know it's a lot to read. But what it comes down to is they say, we're really quite good in having these models and looking at risks in isolation. We're not that great yet in analyzing how these things interact in a complex world. And what I would like to point out is the word complex, because it's something very different from complicated. Complicated is something is constant, it's difficult, but if you're smart enough, you get a bunch of smart people in the room, you spend time on it and you crack it. It's something very different with complexity, because the right answer changes all the time. Because a system is a complex system with a lot of interactions, such as our world. The correct course of action changes all the time. So in that world, if you stick to the formulas that have worked in the past, that might actually be very dangerous. So I think that's one of the, and I should say probably, we at KPMG started to think about this after the financial crisis. Okay, how are we, when we are going into the audit and assessing things like going concern, what can we learn from the crisis? And one of the things was these beautiful models that sometimes have won people Nobel Prizes, they always make a lot of assumptions. There are a lot of assumptions in there sometimes about independence, normal distributed errors, homoscedasticity, but even apart from all that, you still assume that if you take past data, the formula that you can use to then put that data in a forecast is going to be the same. That's still an assumption of constancy. And maybe that's not always the case. And there's an obvious reason why we do that, because what else can we do then if the past is not a predictor of the future? So that's, I think, why we still keep using those, because they're very alluring, because they're precise. And precise means it's almost like it's accurate. It's not the same thing. So I think that's one of the things that we learned. Oh, I didn't know that animation was in there. Okay, so this is another one from her book. And these are not just banking crises. These are overall crises. And it's just to show how unusual this flat line is. And you should know that also all these beautiful complicated models that we use and won prizes were developed over this period of time with these time series. That's why they worked so beautifully. And that's why they stopped working so beautifully around there. So I think that's something that if we want to be forward-looking, we also have to, there's also a human component to this, which is we need to be a little bit more humble and maybe be able to say, we don't really know what's going to happen. This one expert probably doesn't know everything. And then it's going to get messy, because then what do you do? Because I realize none of what I've just said is very actionable. So what we started to explore with the tools was something called expert elicitation. It's not from us. None of what we use is from us. It's from academics, and in this case, it's from the US Army, who in the 1950s wanted to have intelligence about what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. And they didn't have any data. So they came up with this new method. They took a bunch of experts, and they said, what do you think is going to happen? Now, we probably are all familiar with the studies that show if you have one expert, they're about as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee. But if you take a group of experts, in our case, we used 16 to 20, and you average that out, I should note it should be a diverse group. So you average out human biases, because people are biased. That's where we get into the messy territory. So that's why you need to have a diverse group. So we average out human biases. And that turns out, again, by many great scientists like Surowiecki, the wisdom of the crowds, that turns out to be the best forecaster that we can get in a world that's not constant, that is complex, that's inherently dynamic. So that's what we started out with, and it's again, this is proliferating in the science, but we have just started to use that in KPMG. Obviously, these experts are very much still informed by all these beautiful models. We still look at data, but then it's almost like a bit rehabilitating one of the key things that really only humans have, which is imagination. It's what separates us from all the beautiful models. It's also what separates us from other animals, our frontal lobe. We can imagine things that haven't occurred yet. So that's, for example, why we've used it. We've used it in many ways. IT risk, cyber risk, climate risk as well. We know that's going to be a huge financial impact, but it's very hard to model because it's unprecedented. So that's how we started to use it. So what it is, we start with a group of experts and give them a risk list, and we ask them to connect it. Then we get a network that you see in the middle, and on that we apply mathematics, but it's pure linear algebra. It's just to make it palpable. In other words, we do not put any assumptions in there. We just manipulate it into something that is then actionable for the C-board, for the C-suite. And then what comes out of that is that you can have very, you go to scenario analysis and you go to something that is, again, you work with humans there. You write a story. So based on this network, and we see these flows that are likely, what could be the story there? You generate, I'm sure you're all familiar with scenario analysis. You generate a couple of stories, again, using human beings. Then you assign figures to that, and then you start your sensitivity analysis. So that's what we've been doing in a nutshell. And of course, Roger, the audit partner, can explain much better than I can how this has helped our clients. But it's really a way of looking at, for example, this is the old way, right? Likelihood, impact. And then you would only look at these risks in the old way. And what we do now is we still look at this, obviously, but we also look, okay, how are they connected? So these nodes in the middle, they are more influential. They trigger other risks. So this risk, for example, here, we would not look at it because it's in this lower quadrant. But now, with dynamic risk assessment, we can see this one actually triggers a lot of other bigger risks. And that's how we augment our analysis. And I'm going to leave it to you, Roger, to see what the benefits are.
Thank you. So from an audit perspective, the historical way that we look at risk is that two linear dimension in terms of likelihood and magnitude. And we think about it in the context of what the risks would be if they're manifested in the financial statements and how it would impact what's being reported within the organization. And so we also think about it in the context of control risk and how that mitigates the risks of misstatement within financial statements. We think about fraud risks and where management may be manipulating results with respect to their financial statements. But our objective is not even to assess going concern, it's to assess the overall presentation of the financial statements, which includes going concern. And hence, when we're evaluating risks across an organization and trying to assess what's its impact to the audit plans that we pursue, the objective is not to just solely identify business risk and what could cause a company to go wrong, but rather what are the issues that could lead to misstatements in the financial statements. And that's our objective. So a basic tenet of what I think came out of the financial crisis and learning from that was a question as it relates to, well, is it sufficient just to look at the financial statements and determine are they fairly presented? Is there more that is expected? Is there more that is needed as it relates to the information that we have as auditors and making judgments about what's appropriate in the context of the business risks that a company faces and the issues that we're reporting on? Today, the way we are structured and the reporting requirements that we have, nothing's changed since that time. And arguably, if you were to go back and look at the failures that did exist, I don't know of any companies that went back and restated their financial results. The financials ultimately were reflecting what was reported at the time. Valuations changed clearly in underlying assets as a result of the financial crisis, but nothing was going back into the historical periods to say those prior periods were not stated correctly. So from an auditor's standpoint, we are trying to assess how do we look at this information to make judgments about what else should we do. Regardless of where regulation ends up, should we be thinking about models such as these that would help us in better determining where risk truly lies and what might manifest itself, not just in the financial statements that we're reporting on right now, but then also future considerations of other events and how those might unfold. I will say, though, our reporting responsibilities don't include that. So it is a real issue for us in terms of talking with clients and figuring out where our responsibility lies versus a company itself and what they themselves should be having. And in terms of models and the ability to better predict and better assess where their risks are and what's the likelihood of them running into other business risks, other business issues, and contagion effects of things that they're not aware of. I think that's an issue, certainly as we think about regulation and responsibilities. There needs to be some consideration as to exactly how that plays out. Our view is we want to certainly share insights and knowledge that we gain through the process of our audit procedures and figure out what is valuable insight to be able to share with a C-suite, a board, and to give them the proper information that an independent auditor should be giving and not stepping in and becoming part of their responsibilities either. So it's an interesting position that we find ourselves in that we think we've got some capabilities that do give us better insights as to where risk lies and what could occur in terms of the information that the executives at an organization might be able to give us insights around. But we have that dichotomy of what our responsibilities are under auditing standards. And so we are still exploring exactly how we use these capabilities, these models, to try to help us gauge what is our responsibilities under auditing standards. And so we look forward to continuing the dialogue and the educational process with regulators, with clients, and the broader public as to how we see these capabilities influencing and helping determination of risk, but also then figuring out where's that lead us to in terms of the context of an audit.
Great, thank you very much. Dan, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. No one's interrupted us yet. I'm going to try and get some controversy going. As Martin said, I have two main business lines with my company, Frontline Analysts. I have a reputable business in which I assist European banks to save money on counterparty credit analysis via offshore outsourcing. And I have a somewhat more disreputable business where I advise hedge funds and family offices, broadly speaking, how to make money out of other people's trouble. It's in the second of those two capacities I think I'm mainly addressing these remarks, because one of the questions that Martin asked us to consider when we were thinking about this panel is one that I think I've got an answer to, and possibly one that people in this room might or might not like to hear. And that is, does financial reporting offer sufficient information to assess systemic risk? And I think my three-part answer to that is no, it doesn't. In all probability, it can't. And even to the extent that it can, it currently won't, unless some things are quite fundamentally reorganised in many ways along the lines that Gaël and Roger have been talking about here. And the reason that I say that financial reporting doesn't and possibly can't help us represent systemic risk is that really it's part of the definition of a systemic risk that it's a situation where some of the assumptions underlying the accounting data need to be revisited. It's possibly no coincidence that when you look at the history of banking crises in particular, an awful lot of them have had commercial real estate as a major contributing factor. And there's a reason for that. It's because in commercial real estate, you can come in one morning, decide that investment value in use is no longer an appropriate basis, revalue a whole load of things on the basis of fair value quick sale, and suddenly all of your underlying assumptions on which you'd extended credit against that commercial real estate have been undermined. Someone this morning cited Nassim Taleb and the Black Swan. Again, a true black swan is something outside the domain of experience. For a lot of the sessions this morning, we've been talking about accounting data in terms of means versus dispersion. And that's great. That's a much more sophisticated way of thinking about these things than just simply thinking about a point estimate. But really, I'd almost argue it goes a bit deeper than that. If we think about the Greek sovereign crisis, was that really a particularly outlying observation of the underlying distribution of CDS spreads? Or was the CDO crisis a particularly tail observation of the underlying rate of return on AAA-rated bonds? Was kind of Enron just quite a large earnings miss? In all those cases, I'd answer, no, they weren't. It's not a useful way of thinking to think of those as draws from a random probability distribution. They were, as Guy and Roger were saying, they were systems. They were specific systems of events that had their own causes and events. In the case of Greece, we had a paradigm shift from a world in which OECD sovereigns, and particularly Euro member sovereigns, were money good, to one in which a European sovereign debt portfolio was also a credit portfolio. In the case of the CDOs, we had a fundamental shift of assumptions that geographical diversification in US real estate markets didn't work because all of those markets had gone through the same process of aggressive mis-selling of subprime debt. In the case of Enron, everyone just suddenly had to realize that a whole load of debt-bearing entities had been inappropriately deconsolidated, and that turned out to be a practice that was rife throughout the tech and telecoms industry. Great, first interruption.
So what you just described says to me at least, we've done our job properly, reported on fundamentals, they've audited properly, the credit agencies have done their work properly. You wouldn't have had that need for a catalyst to actually reflect the underlying. The problem was that we rely on some statistics, we rely on distribution, and we think that the math or the statistics can tell us what's underneath.
Yeah.
So it is a problem that in part we all created in the way that we do it.
Absolutely, but I don't want to kind of blame anyone because this is how business has to be done. It goes back to the great blue diagram of decision support. A lot of the business of financial reporting is making an unmanageable amount of data manageable. It has to be summarized in some way. I believe it can be done better, but realistically, there's not much alternative to the practice of regarding things as black boxes. But this does reliably cause trouble because, and I think that the accountancy profession is part of this, because everyone else regards the reported accounts of a company as a black box most of the time. It's a black box which gives you a number, and that's a number that you can rely upon. You guys should be proud of this. There's absolutely no other profession, maybe the actuaries, that get trusted like this. Even doctors, people will second guess them. But an audited set of accounts gives you the number. And it's the number right up until the moment when suddenly people say, actually, I now think that this is a black box that's unreliable, and I'm now going to treat this as unreliable, and that's where you get problems having. I worked at Credit Suisse during the sort of 2008-2009 crisis, and because I'm a quite awkward and annoying person, not many people will talk to me, so I tend to seek out other unpopular people. And one of the most unpopular people in Credit Suisse was the guy who ran the dollar funding desk. So it happened to be that I was friends with him in 2007, and then everyone wanted to be friends with him in 2008 and 2009 because suddenly a part of the bank which previously had been about as prestigious as mending the vending machines became the absolute centre of the thing. And I'll never forget what he told me about the phrase that nearly destroyed the world economy in 2008. And that was the phrase, "We're having a meeting at the weekend." Because it was this guy's job to fund the dollar desk of Credit Suisse. And the way he did that was by borrowing US dollars from loads and loads of nice, sleepy, friendly, regulator-friendly Californian savings banks. And then it would turn out that one kind of Thursday afternoon, as he was making his calls, the savings bank in Irvine, California would say, "We know your credit's good, but..." I can't do the accent, so I won't try. "We know your credit's good, we know you guys are good for it, but everything in New York at the moment, it's just going so crazy. So we've decided we're not going to put anything out on the street now. We're having a meeting at the weekend, and I'm sure we'll be back facing you by Monday, Wednesday at the latest." And no one kind of understood that the one thing a global financial system cannot do is take a 2 or 3 day break just for everyone to get their bearings again. Once that black box breaks down, that's where you get the problems, because really people don't look inside it and people don't look at the systems models that produce these things. I have to say, my view is that one of the worst parts of black box thinking in the financial system is the relationship between bank supervisors and accountants. I think that is dysfunctional. I think that could be improved hugely. Most of the fault in this area, I would say, is almost certainly on the bank regulator's side. I'll give 2 concrete examples of that before I sort of finish and wait for everyone to throw things at me. Firstly, we have the leverage ratio, which was enacted as part of Basel III. That is in itself a pretty good ratio. There are lots of very sensible arguments, I think Martin has made some of them in print, for having a supplementary leverage ratio as well as a risk-weighted assets ratio for global banks to maintain. However, the historic record shows that the reason that leverage ratio was implemented goes back to some work by Andy Haldane, in which everything was based on the premise that the leverage ratio was objective and simple as a measure of bank capitalisation. So, I mean, this I thought, and I've at one point told Andy, this is kind of crazy. As Mary Bath said this morning, when you're talking about price to book, we decide what the book is. I don't think anyone who's done a consolidated set of accounts for a major global bank, I've had the fortune to speak to people who've done this, and the 2 things I picked up from them is, 1, they ain't objective, and they certainly ain't simple. It's a good ratio, but bank regulators do not, in my view, have a high level of understanding of what financial statements are made of in terms of assumptions and creations. The second one is actually rather more problematic at the moment, which is I don't think it's too strong a word to use, embarrassment of IFRS 9 transition in the European Union. IFRS 9 is introduced. It's a standard under which banks have to make bad debt provisions on more of a forward-looking basis than was previously the case. For that reason, there is a day 1 negative effect on the valuation of those loans under IFRS 9, which would have caused considerable capital embarrassment for some of the banks, particularly in peripheral Europe, with a large non-performing loan book. For this reason, it was decided that there needed to be some transitional provisions for that. The way that Europe has enacted that, basically on the advice of the Basel Committee, who have to take their share of the blame for this, is that if you take your loan book valued at 100, and IFRS requires you to reduce its value to 70, for sake of argument, on the basis of forward-looking expected loss, then you have a loss of 30. For regulatory capital purposes, you are then entitled to put a positive item in your regulatory capital of 30, which is labelled IFRS 9 transition. You then amortise that over the next 3 years. This is, in itself, not particularly sophisticated, but the fun and games starts because the Basel IFRS 9 transition item is not linked to any particular asset. In particular, it is not linked to the loan book whose revaluation was responsible for its creation. So if you are a bank, you can then sell the loan book, which is marked in your books at 100. You can sell it at fair value, which is 70, realizing a cash loss, but not touching the accounting item of positive 30 in your regulatory capital, which means that for the next 2 or 3 years, a large number of European banks who have sold NPL books are going to have purely fictitious items in their capital. This is something which causes investors to go kind of white when I tell them about it. And the reason it is in there is that the standards were put together by the standard setters without any real communication to the bank supervisors. The bank supervisors found out about IFRS 9 embarrassingly late in the process, much too late to have material input into the drafting of the standard, and significantly too late to come up with a more sensible transition regime. I personally think, and I know that some other people on the panel have views on this too, that in general, the relationship between the regulators and the accountancy profession is not great. I think that is certainly something that could be done a lot better. I also think in general, we need to find more of a language for communicating the uncertainty around accounting numbers. And I think I'll stop there and let someone else shout at me.
Thank you very much. Just wondering if there's any questions from the floor or any contributions. Yes, gentleman over there.
I have a question for Roger. You mentioned that you have these new insights into risks that are faced by companies, but right now you don't have an obligation to report them. Are some of these things that you might discuss under the proposed critical audit matters discussion or expanded audit report?
That's a possibility. I think that still is in its infancy in terms of what's being drafted and what's being considered. I think the concepts of what's included in there is a discussion around the critical estimates and some of the judgments that have been made as it relates to underlying values that are assigned to principally the assets, but certainly liabilities as well, within a company's financial statement. So it should be an element of that discussion that also then provides some perspective of where risk is and what could change as it relates to that risk. Those are things that certainly could be expanded. It's not definitive it will be yet, though.
This question is for Dan. Yes, your comments were controversial. I would agree with that for sure. Your point about the regulators and the accounting standard setters not talking, I'd like to hear your views. What do you think could have been gained by them talking earlier, by the two bodies getting together? Would you expect that the standards should have been changed because of that communication? Or in this particular example that you gave me, is that a failure on the part of the regulators with their transition, whereby they should have said that the transition that is going to be done has to be immediately the example that you gave. If somebody comes and sells off all their loans at a loss of 30, then immediately the transition ends there and you should write off all that 30 at that spot. So it seems like it's a problem, to me immediately at least, it seems like the regulators in the Basel did not do their jobs properly, and I don't think that could have been any way improved by discussing it earlier with the standard setters.
I think that saying that the regulators didn't do their jobs properly is quite a strong accusation to make, and I think that it's broadly accurate. No, I mean, the sensible method would have been to do exactly what you say, to simply say that the IFRS 9 transition relates to the IFRS 9 transition assets, and that therefore when you sell a loan book that you have revalued downwards, that you make the same adjustment to that. That was indeed one of the proposals made when the regulators, absurdly late in the day, made their statements on IFRS 9 transition in the capital regulations. The feedback from the industry, which was unusually for industry feedback pretty much accurate rather than special pleading, was that there was no way that they could set up the systems and the kind of the technology and the reporting systems to do that in the time available, but unless someone was prepared to delay the implementation of IFRS 9 for 12 months. So simply, I think it is that if the communication had been better and the Basel Committee had been engaged with the accounting profession earlier, this would not have been such a problem, because exactly the solution that you suggest could and should have been imposed if it had been communicated to the banking industry 12 months earlier than it actually was. This was just simply something that happened because people knew that there was this thing called IFRS 9 coming along, but no one in the regulatory community really considered it to be enough of a priority for them. And my personal reason for belief is that the reason for that is that it's a central banking culture. It's a culture of economists and lawyers, and there are very surprisingly few qualified accountants, full stop, let alone qualified accountants who are engaged with their own professional debates in the standard setters, working in financial regulatory organisations.
That question that you asked, Shiva, is actually quite broad, and maybe that some of the other panel members can add something to that, because it's not only, it's a cultural thing, but maybe Haya can speak on that, and Nicolas, he's more like an outsider on this point, but it's a deep point also.
Well, I feel like, I haven't been a regulator for 3 years now, but looking back, I have to agree that it's very accurate. We all have and this again goes a little bit back to thinking in isolation and also being organized in isolation. So I was working, for example, after the crisis, I was working in a Basel workstream on revamping the securitization framework on credit. We were only working on credit. Then there was another group that was working on market risk. Another one was working on liquidity risk for securitizations. Sometimes we talked. And that was it. So let alone that we spoke about, okay, so how does this impact the overall market? Now we've vastly increased capital charges for securitizations. Does that maybe mean that we push too much leverage into another asset? That's not something that we were mandated to do. We were just there to revamp the framework, and that's what we did. Without really looking at what's going to be the systemic impact. And I do agree that, and the cultural remark is right. It's not a culture where you really have to push people to talk to each other. And that's, again, you get into messy stuff because it's human and it's social, but you really, a proper management would be, how do we get our people to talk more? Because otherwise you're going to get these things where you're too late. Yeah.
Nicolas?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult cultural gap to bridge, right, between a culture of macroeconomic analysis and a culture of looking at the details and the kind of things you debate in accounting, standard setting, and the like. A colleague of mine who is a little bit of an authority in macro research recently said in private, if the plumbing is important, then all macroeconomists are dead, which I think summarizes it quite nicely. I'm following Dan, and he's blaming the regulators, but in a way I think the problem is deeper. It's academic silos. Because if you want to succeed at the central banks, the IMF, the BIS, this kind of institutions, you better be a trained economist. Now, it so happens that trained economists are not trained in accounting. So I think if you want really to bridge that divide, many central banks, certainly the IMF, made a lot of efforts to bring these different cultures together. They generally fail because they cannot work it for the entire system because it's so embedded in the faculties and schools of our higher education systems. So I would rather envisage taking it at the root, but that you work in universities, you know about academic silos, and you know how unrealistic my suggestion is here.
The only thing that I can add to that is if you look at the Basel Committee, all the important rules come from the Policy Development Group. And then there's the accounting task force. So the task force, as the name sort of suggests, is meant to be eliminated at some point, which is kind of typical for an organization to have all the important rules set by a non-task force, and then a task force for the accounting. So mind you, if you look at the accounting standards coming out of Basel, knowing that there's also an auditor or experienced auditor working on these standards also.
Trevor. So I think, to some extent, the point is being missed. If you take CECL, which we're going to have here, which is it's more extreme in some sense than IFRS 9 in terms of the impact it's going to have. And my understanding is the Federal Reserve's done the same thing as the European central banks. But the issue is, if we have any idea about pricing credit risk, it should be trivial to actually measure the expected credit losses, especially the way it's implied in the United States. And the way CECL is being approached, so in principle, the auditors and the regulators who have access to, especially the examiners, have as much detail as they want to go into. Why should you be surprised at all? Why should there be such an issue? And part of it is the systems haven't been developed to so-called show this in a way that is auditable and verifiable. So frankly, doing all this network is not going to help you. The real question is, why don't we pay attention to fundamentals? Why don't we go back to the basic economics of transactions and how they get aggregated up into our systems and worry about financial reports? Now it's going to be in compliance with GAAP. None of this should be a surprise. The problem is that that's not the way a lot of businesses operate and haven't built their systems that way. And frankly, that's where the auditing profession should have done anything. And frankly, when you talk about the European banks being integrated, or not European, all being integrated, that's part of the counterparty risks that is going to go crazy when people start seeing all this stuff. The capital could easily have been raised in advance or not. Okay? They have to do it because no one's going to give them the capital until they know and they can get revealed to this. So, I think we can blame human behavior, but it's much more basic than that. It's just doing the accounting the right way and relating it to economics, which we don't do. So my question is, why aren't you doing that in the auditing from the starting point?
I surmise that was your question. I'm not sure if I would want to speak on behalf of the profession in terms of the judgments that are being made or some of the comments that you're attributing to the profession. As it relates to our role as an independent auditor, it starts with companies having the appropriate systems in place and having as much information in place as they can to make objective conclusions. That doesn't necessarily happen because the circumstances don't allow it. There's subjective estimations with respect to, as it relates to financial institutions specifically, as it relates to many factors, that you could have the best models in the world, but it's not easy for them to then see what is happening outside of just the four walls of their organization. They can see things that they're influencing by, but they're not going to see other parties' book of business and say, I've got a complete understanding of what our risks truly are.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, please.
But then how can anyone say we can do stress tests?
That's a separate question that you could certainly ask of the regulators, but I think as a regulator, you're now having access to more information across all of those institutions so that you have better visibility in terms of what people are reporting and what people are gathering and providing you. The audit firms don't have that complete visibility. Certainly, the institutions themselves do not. So I think they're trying to, I think the companies try to gather as much information as they can. They have clearly sophisticated models that they believe are reliant for them, set for their purposes in terms of what they're reporting on. But there's not a perfect set of data points that they can go back out and use independently and objectively to measure the way you're describing. And hence, the audit firms then coming in and looking at it are trying to make judgments based upon our knowledge of what they're using, our knowledge of what we see across an industry, but again, not with perfect knowledge of seeing what happens across an entire industry, because it's typically just that one team, that one client, making their conclusions.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that that's exactly the kind of thing that it's very, maybe that goes back to the humility as well. It's very alluring to think if we just get it right, then it will be good, and then we will be safe. And I think that's just, I think it's an illusion. And it's like Roger says, it's a moving target. So it's better to be aware of that, doing the best you can, but also realizing what's best changes over time. And I think the other part of humility is also realizing that you have a system in the organization, and then, of course, the organization is part of a larger system. And I'm a bit repeating what Roger said, but then you don't know what the others do. So that's why you have the scenario analysis, where you can at least make an educated guess about that. But the idea that everything around us is just objective as long as we value it, do our jobs right, I don't think that's a reality.
I'm not saying it's objective. I believe you have to do the scenario, but it's based off a fundamental. There's nobody who, if they'd looked and seen that a CEO squared was off a triple B, would ever have thought it was a triple A if they were looking at fundamentals. You don't have to be.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. I see your point, and that's a good point, and I think that's exactly where the expert elicitation comes in. If we weren't so blinded by our models, you could get a group of experts in the room and say, this actually, just by common sense, doesn't look right to me. And that's actually the genesis of dynamic risk assessment. It was actually by an Australian auditor who did this for a bank in 2007 and then said, actually, you're not as strong as you think you are. And he was thrown out of the committee because they said, look at us, we're making so much money. And then I think it was a couple of weeks later that the Minister of Finance called him about his report. And after that, that's when we started to really apply DRA.
Roger Willett.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Trevor, basically, that one of the problems I think you've got with all of this is that you want objective information to sort of build scientific models, and you've been talking about models, but you haven't been talking very much about measurement. You've talked about macroeconomic accounting, and you've talked about microeconomic accounting, but that's where the big problem is. They're basically very similar rules, but they're structured. The information in macroaccounting is structured very differently to the way it is in microaccounting. There's absolutely no reason why that should be the case. You could easily construct balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements for nations and regions in the same way that you can for companies. Now, if you did that, it'd be much easier to see the links. If you had a decent measurement system, you could then build decent models, scientific models, on the basis of what would be much closer to the objective measures that you see in science. At the moment, you can't, because there really is. It's quite difficult to see, say, the relationship between GDP and earnings. We were talking about that this morning. Now, I mean, you've got value added. You can easily measure value added in companies, and you can relate that more easily to the value added in the economy. But we don't do that. We don't either convert our micro accounts to the macro accounting concepts, and we don't convert the macro accounting concepts to the micro accounting concepts. So how can you possibly see the relationship between them when you build models that try and relate the micro to the macro economy?
So I think this is a fascinating point, which to me is social science reductionism, right? It's saying if you understand physics, you understand biology. If you understand biology, you understand politics. Well, reductionism works to a certain extent, but only to a certain extent. And if I take a step back and I look at accounting histories, there have been those swings of the pendulum. To take only one obvious divide, there have been moments when people wanted to think about stocks and understood flows as the time variation of stocks. And there were moments when people preferred to think about flows and understood stocks as the accrued changes brought by flows. So these are fundamentally different perspectives. And if you look at, and they're socially constructed. So the idea is that you could have a single model that goes from the individual component of a firm's business all the way to the global economy is incredibly reductionist. And I have sympathy for it as a matter of principle. I have no sympathy for it as a matter of practice. So if I come from a country which has a strong accounting tradition, that's France, the concept was invented in Germany, as some of you know, that you have to have complete consistency between the national accounts and the accounts of small enterprises, right? That's the Plan Comptable Général, and I don't remember the German word for it. Schmalenbach and all that. It works in theory. It doesn't work in practice. And I think we have to work with the different perspectives that come with different scales of observations. Otherwise, we go nowhere. Sorry for challenging your point of view. And again, I have sympathy for it, but I'm just skeptical.
I know there are different views on this. All I would say is that I don't think it's ever been done properly.
Well, France did their best. So did Germany during the last World War. And here we are.
I do think, though, just on that point, though, and maybe building on what my colleague said, corporations that are the linchpin to the financial reporting framework, that's not the data that they're capturing. They're capturing their micro transactions, the information that's relevant to them, and they may have a perspective. Certainly, they have a perspective on the macro trends and how it's influencing their business. But they're using that as it relates to making planning decisions, execution of some of their issues. They're not going back in and reconciling activity, though, to that. They're not going back in and trying to prove out models that would say, here's what those results were, or challenging them. They're dealing with what facts they're aware of, the objective information that they have, and trying to make their best judgments based on that. To the extent that others can develop those models and prove their utility for organizations, that's where there's benefit. And I think that's what's led us to at least say, is there a way to create more objective information from the subjective and micro information that exists in an organization and develop a theory that would allow us to understand more broadly what the impacts of the risks truly are at an organization and learn from that ourselves. That's the concept.
So I'd just like to push back a little slight bit on one of Trevor's points, because I would like to say a couple of words in defence of stress testing. The stress test is fantastic. It's the best thing that the regulatory community ever did. Not because it necessarily measures anything, not because you can come up with a stress situation that actually turns into the worst case scenario, but because it completely changes the relationship between the supervisor and the supervised institution. An annual stress test, a CCAR exercise, is the only time large bank CEOs are forced into a room to confront a set of assumptions that were made by someone who they're not paying, either on the payroll or by the hour as an auditor. It really completely changes that dynamic, and it's all about the communication and the necessity for companies to face up to outside assumptions, which really doesn't happen, in my view, anywhere outside large systemically important banks, and only there in the context of an annual stress test exercise. So I'll stick up for stress tests on that basis.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. We're running out of time now. If there's one question that somebody wants to ask just for that question to fill the last minute, if not, then we can continue this discussion at the break or afterwards. Thank you very much. Thank you.